All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started now. If we could just take another minute to settle down. And Joel, would you mind shutting that door over there? And Kelly, maybe these back doors here? So welcome, everyone. I don't think I have to say make yourself at home and grab something to eat, because I think that's happened already. But my name is Bob Healy with Evolve IP. I want to thank everyone for coming out today for our HITRUST and Cybersecurity conference. Evolve IP, we are the cloud strategy company, and this is not about us today, right? This is about high trust and compliance. But the way we like to position our services is if you need a product, go buy a product. If you need a strategy, come to us. And this is part of that strategy approach. Compliance and security are incredibly important in everything that we do today, in particular in healthcare. So we did our best to round up some of the best talent that we could find to provide some good content and program for you today. So thank you for coming out. I know it's an investment of time. I know several of you flew in, so thank you. Greatly appreciate that. And hopefully today will be entertaining, but also very educational and informative. So thank you. With that, I want to introduce Dave McChrystal. Dave has been, many people in the room, some of our partners, and Dave will speak to that, have been very instrumental in organizing this and putting it together. But here at Evolve IP, Dave really drove that. So a lot of work getting this together today. So Dave, thank you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you. Yes. Welcome to everybody. As Bob said, took some time out of your schedules, and we appreciate that. But many of you may not know, but we are welcoming this audience here today in the room, and we also have a live streaming audience out there that's equally large, if not larger. So we're excited to be doing that, to be bringing this information about HITRUST, about cybersecurity to all of you. And we certainly look throughout the program to get more interaction from you and to hear what questions you're undoubtedly going to develop as we go along. So the basic structure, you've seen it in the material, but we're going to have two keynote speakers. After each of them, we'll have a 10-minute break. So you here in the room can move around and move your bones and get some food and relax for a minute. And then the folks out there on the internet are going to have to just be patient with us till we come back. But the last session of the three is going to be an interactive panel discussion. So we'll have our two keynote speakers, who are Omar Khawaja and Tom Norman. Fantastic. You guys are going to be blown away and impressed, so happy about that. But they're going to join a panel of 5 other industry experts who are going to help us sort out any of the remaining issues and questions that you have. So my last bit of information to share is that none of this would be possible without the support of some of our really important partners in our delivery of that cloud strategy that Bob referred to. And those partners are, many of them, some of them on the panels. You'll hear from them at various points throughout the afternoon. But they are Veeam Software, HPE, VMware, Whipfly, who is Evolve IP's assessor in our HITRUST certification process. And they're going to be on the panel, and they're going to be leading the panel. And then lastly, Fortinet. So without that team surrounding us today would not have been possible. So I want to thank all of them personally. So I will give you just one more step to the main attraction, but here to introduce the main attraction from HPE is Anthony Defazio. So thanks again and have a great afternoon.
So thank you very much. We're very proud and happy to be part of this and sponsor this, and thank you for all coming in here. Been at this event a couple times with the folks here at Evolve, and it's such a great opportunity to learn and understand kind of what's going on in the security space, in particular around healthcare. So this next gentleman, obviously you probably have heard of him before. He's been around a lot of Global 1000s, doing a lot of talk tracks, RSA, CSA, amongst others. Certainly been in the industry 15 plus years, managing and developing and doing his own security in the environments out there. So no stranger to kind of what's going on today and some of the challenges we're all faced with. More recently, I guess, or currently, CISO over at Highmark, which is one of the 3rd largest healthcare integrators and financial networks out there. So, please give a hand for Omar Khawaja, and we'll get you started. Thank you very much.
There you go. Now you're on.
I'm not very good at turning my mic on, by the way. That's good, but all of you heard this. Those on the web stream have no idea what we're talking about. Their loss, and they missed the free lunch too. So, what I realized is the amount of risk that is posed by our information outside of our four walls is significantly greater than the risk posed by what's inside our four walls, and that's simply because of the math. We've got probably 10, 20, 30 times more of our members' information that we ended up sharing with some third party through the course of doing business than that which actually exists within our own four walls. So important to have a good security program at Highmark Health, but probably more important for us to have a phenomenal strategy for ensuring that our members' information, our patients' information is just as secure when it leaves our four walls as when it is inside our four walls. How many of you work for a healthcare company? How many of you work for a company that provides services to a healthcare company? So it looks like most of you are in one or the other, and the rest are just enjoying the wraps, which is good. The wrap was actually really good. So before I jump in, and I've got a lot of slides. I think I have about 25 slides that we will likely walk through, but we can spend slightly less time on the slides if you guys ask me really, really good questions, so we don't have to go through nearly as many slides. So this is your opportunity, because if we wait until the end, what do you think is going to happen? We're going to run out of time. That's what happens every single time. So what are you hoping to get out of this? Some of you flew in, some of you drove in. You're taking time away from your customers, taking time away from your work. Why are you here? What are you hoping to get out of this session? This is where you guys speak and I take notes. And we do have a mic, so we cannot forget those on the live stream. There you go.
So I'm hoping, turn it off?
He's learning from me, keeping the mic on.
It's muted. Hold on.
Thanks. So Omar, I'm hoping to get some great questions, probing questions for my healthcare customers to get them to be interested in hearing about the offerings that Evolve can help them with.
Got it. Okay.
Omar? So my questions were focused on the business associates, which is what I think you were referring to earlier, and the impact on them.
Yep.
Along with, the differentiation between HITRUST and HIPAA.
Okay, so
And
high
then-
trust versus HIPAA.
And then at what point is compliance or certification required?
Good question.
And my question, I guess it's the same as business associate or similar, the vendors. What's the vendor responsibility in this whole process?
Got it. So before we take the mic away, let me just make sure we clarify that question. So vendor responsibility versus business associate. So I think of a business associate as anyone that's working with a covered entity. Generally speaking, a covered entity is either a healthcare payer or provider. And so business associate would be an entity to whom you send protected health information because they're helping you deliver some part of your service. And so when you're thinking vendor, you're thinking someone that is not a business associate or someone that could be a business associate?
Somebody that could be, but maybe not a vendor associate. So let's say somebody that's providing, MDR service or MSSP service to these entities.
Got it. So potentially you're not sending to that vendor any PHI, but there's still some sensitivity in that interaction.
Sensitivity to it, they're touching on that, yeah.
That's a good question. I like that. And then we'll go to Mike.
Yeah. So Omar, I'd be interested to see, and
And I'd be interested in your perspective on the healthcare side. In the financial services side, it's really a question when you talk about third-party risk and measuring it. It's where do the costs, who bears the costs for that?
Good question.
That attestation of adhering to certain compliance standards or regulatory standards. What do you see on the healthcare side? Obviously, you've got the big insurance companies like Highmark and some of the Aetnas of the world. And then obviously you've got a lot of the covered entities and the BAAs. Is there still that sort of tug and pull between the different organizations saying, hey, you're asking me to attest to certain standards, but I'm then caused to bear that cost? And I know in financial services there's a big tug of war between the larger entities and some of the smaller entities.
That's good. Thank you, Mike. Finally, there's at least one question that I actually have a slide on.
Okay.
Clearly, I don't have enough slides. That is the problem. Karen.
So we spend, as the auditors, a lot of time educating our clients on the importance of managing their third parties.
Yeah.
Every year we go back and organizations are outsourcing more and more.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious to see what your perspective on what they should be doing to manage their third parties.
Got it. So concern with outsourcing more and how do they manage that? Okay. And then Denny?
Yeah. So you might have a slide on this, I don't know, but just where's the greatest potential for the risk that you need to watch out for in the first place?
Greatest potential for risk. Okay. There may be 12 slides that cover that. That's a big question. But a good one.
Thanks. I'm curious what kind of adoption you're seeing from some of the statewide or regional health information exchanges. Are they coming up to speed on HITRUST, and at what rate?
Got it. Okay. Good one. Okay.
So I help build tools and applications for providers and covered entities. So from the beginning, like what should precautionary measures I should look at to build it right and more secure, and avoid the risks, like preventive steps I could do from a design and development perspective.
Okay. Like it. Good question. Okay, so I think that's a long enough list. I'll share a few general thoughts, and then we'll jump into the conversation. And I think I'm probably gonna cover at least 60 to 70% of these items, and then we'll make sure there's time left at the end. So if there's anything that's unanswered, we'll make sure to address that as well. There's a lot of question around costs, around risks, what's the biggest, what's the smallest. So here's a question for you. How do you measure risk? How do you measure risk? How would you like to measure risk? If you went to your CFO, what would he ask you for?
You want to try to come up with some kind of numbers or metrics.
Yeah, some kind of a number would be helpful, because that's how we're used to measuring. We're measuring impact in the business world. So I'll share with you some numbers that can help. I don't think any of these numbers are exact, and they don't work for every single organization. But you can at least start to get some parameters and some boundaries to then start to define what it looks like for you. According to the Ponemon Institute, and I'm not saying that these are the best numbers out there, but these are a set of numbers. IBM commissioned a study by the Ponemon Institute, and they came out with the average cost to the victim organization of a single record being breached is, who knows the number? How many dollars? Of a single record. So one person's information being breached. Any idea what the costs are?
There's a number of numbers that are out there, but one I heard this week was $141
That's about right. So about $140. Now that same study says that if that single record breached happened to be a healthcare record, that cost is more than twice as much. The cost to the victim organization is closer to $402 per record. So that gives you an idea of what the cost is if you're dealing with any record versus when you're dealing with specifically a healthcare record. There's also a number from that study that says, what's the cost of an average data breach? How often does a data breach involve a single record? Very seldom, right? More often than not, there's multiple records that are breached, and that study says the cost of an average data breach is about $4 million. So now we're starting to get some numbers, and in your organization, you may say the costs are higher, you may say the costs are lower. I would tend to provide the guidance that the Ponemon numbers are probably on the higher end of things and most costs are lower. If you're looking for another point of view, I would recommend looking at the 2016 Verizon Business Data Breach Investigations Report, and they've got a good section on looking at the Ponemon numbers and some others and triangulating to what they say are the right numbers, and that the numbers actually change depending on the average size of the breach involved. So I would encourage you to look at that. The other thing that I have to look at, because at Highmark Health, we are a provider, we are a payer, we run 8 hospitals, about 400 physician offices. We also provide medical, vision, and dental insurance to customers all over the country. All told, we have about 45 million customers across the country who we're responsible for, and protecting their information is the thing that keeps me up at night, because that is my responsibility. How many people like the cost of healthcare? Exactly. So do you know what it would cost you if you were the victim of medical identity theft? Someone stole your information. Now you're the victim of medical identity theft. Any idea what it would end up costing you to make yourself whole? Throw out a number. Make a guess.
10,000.
10,000, okay. Very bold. A little bit lower. Actually, a lot lower. It's about $2,528 according to a study from Accenture that was done earlier this year. So now when I go to my business and I talk about the importance of security, I not only talk to them about what it would cost us, I talk to them about what it would cost our customers, because we, like all of you, care about your customers. And so if your customers had to incur that $2,528, what budget do you think that would come out of? Their healthcare budget. So as a result of that, they're going to be able to buy $2,528 less of healthcare services because they spent that money on their response to medical identity theft. Not a good way of spending their money, because do you think that $2,500 actually made them healthier? No. So we're always looking at all the costs and taking a very customer-centric approach or a business-centric approach. So just to say the risks are high, the risks are low, it is, the breach is going to happen, here's the last headline, that doesn't really make for a very sophisticated conversation that you're going to be able to have with your customers or with your business month over month, year over year. After the first year or two, it's going to get old, and they're going to say, you keep talking to us about the data breach and it hasn't happened to us, please go away. We're sick of hearing the same story over and over again. Important to have a message that actually resonates with your customers and with your business, and important to have a clicker that resonates with the PowerPoint slide that's not advancing. Oh, there you go, magic. So today I'm going to talk about a few different things. First, I'm going to talk about the third-party risk program at Highmark Health and what it looked like, what the before view of third-party risk looked like. Then I'll talk about what approach we took to solve things from a third-party risk management standpoint, and then where did we end up as a result of that. So before we built out the third-party risk program at Highmark Health, we applied some very specific criteria to figure out how to construct that program. And the criteria fell into 3 categories: effectiveness, efficiency, and coverage. So what we'll do for most of this afternoon is we'll actually walk through what that criteria was, and on a spectrum where Highmark fell compared to where we wanted to be, and then we'll talk about where we actually ended up against that, that same criteria. Okay, so the first thing that we looked at is the effectiveness, and under effectiveness we cared about the credibility of the control framework. So if we are going to our third parties, and so maybe I'll pause here for a second just to introduce some terminology. So I will use the words third party, maybe even vendor, and business associate interchangeably. That means, or service provider. Those are folks that you're paying money to give you some kind of a service, and as part of that interaction, you are sharing confidential information with them. So third party, business associate, vendor, service provider, I'm going to use synonymously for the purposes of this session. The converse of that, I'm going to use the company, the organization, the enterprise, the covered entity, or the relying party. All of those represent the organization that's paying money to someone else to deliver services to them. So if me, as the relying party, as the organization that's receiving services, is now going to a third party and saying, I want you to have these security controls implemented, and if you have these controls implemented, we're going to feel like you're doing a good job protecting our information. How credible is the set of controls that I'm giving to that third party? Is it homegrown within the enterprise, which would put it on the low end of the spectrum, or is it some globally accepted standard across all industries that I could share with them? And if so, that would end up being high on the spectrum. So every slide I'm going to show you is going to have low, it's going to have high, and we're going to talk about the prior state, where was Highmark on this spectrum, and where is the desired state. In an ideal world, where would we like to be? Does that make sense? So we had a homegrown set of questions that someone came up with before I joined the organization and said, we're going to tell everyone they have to live up to these compliance requirements. The next thing that we care about is the selection of the required controls. So how do you decide out of these 20 or 30 or 100 or 300 or 3,000 controls, which of them are applicable to the third party in any given specific situation? Because is every control applicable in every situation, in every context? No. You have to be able to determine which set of controls, and on the low end of effectiveness, you can have something that's completely open interpretation. So you get to decide whatever you want. I could do something like HIPAA says, which is administrative, technical, and physical controls. And you get to decide what constitutes administrative, technical, and physical control. And one person could decide that means 10 controls, and another person could decide that means 1,000 controls. It's completely open to interpretation, versus the other side is it's very explicitly prescribed with absolutely no deviations permitted. So a good example of something on the left side is SOC 2. In SOC 2, it is a reporting framework. It is not a control framework. Management gets to decide what controls you want to put into the SOC 2. Now, the AICPA has some basic requirements, but I, as management, can decide, for us, a strong password is 4 digits. And that's what I decided, and I can bring in an AICPA firm to then attest that those controls are in place. And AICPA firm isn't necessarily going to say I've got good or bad security. They're just going to say that I have the controls in place that I said that I have in place. It's up to me to decide what those controls are. It's completely open interpretation. Whereas on the other side, you can have something like the PCI DSS, the data security standard, which is obligatory for anyone that processes credit cards. In that case, they've got a set of 12 requirements, not very open to deviations, and everyone has to implement exactly those requirements. If you're small, if you're large, that is the set of requirements. So in our prior state, we said, here's the requirements. It doesn't matter if you're a small BA with 3 employees or if you're a large BA with 150,000 employees, the requirements are all exactly the same. Does that make sense? Probably not. Does it make sense to be on the low end of the spectrum? Probably not. You don't want to give too much flexibility. You don't want to give too little flexibility. Where we wanted to be was right in the middle. The next thing that we looked at was the efficacy of control validation. This is basically saying, how do we know if those controls are actually implemented? On the low end of the spectrum, we're saying we do nothing. As we move a little bit further out, we're saying, hey, we've got a self-assessment questionnaire. So our vendor, our third party, our business associate completes a questionnaire that we send to them, and they choose to fill it out in the way that they would like to fill it out. And then you've got contractual language for all third parties. So we got the lawyers involved, we've got procurement involved, and we contractually obligated a third party to put all of those controls in place. On the high end, we actually have an evidentiary review of policies and validation of every single control, and then there's some stuff in the middle. How many of you have ever sent a questionnaire or received one? Okay, most of you. So if you received a questionnaire and on the questionnaire it said something like, which pretty much every questionnaire I've ever seen says this, do you encrypt data at rest? And if I told you I had a flash drive that I encrypted last year, could I answer yes to that question? So how valuable is a questionnaire? It's extremely open to interpretation, and when you respond, it's very difficult to provide valuable information and accurate information, and it's not because people are necessarily being malicious or they're being elusive, but it's just that the questionnaire only has a certain level of efficacy and capability that it can deliver. We know from some of the reviews of self-assessment questionnaires and then subsequent comparison to the on-site assessments that the average questionnaire, the accuracy of an average questionnaire is somewhere around 50 to 60%. So 40 to 50% of information in the average questionnaire is incorrect. Yet there is such an extreme reliance on questionnaires in the healthcare industry and other industries as well. Why do you think we like questionnaires? We all know, especially for those of you that are paranoid security professionals, we all know in our heart of hearts that questionnaires are not very useful. Yet we continue to use them and we continue to promote them. And the reason is very simple. It's because it's easy. I could create a questionnaire and I can send it out to 100 of my BAs. It may take me 2 days to do that. Versus if I had to go on site and painstakingly validate every single control, that does not feel like something viable. It does not feel practical, so I'm probably not going to do it, and I'll stick to the left-hand side of the spectrum. That's where we were. Where would we like to be? On the other side of the spectrum. Because that's when we start to see real information and we start to see real data and we can actually trust it and we're actually following the data. The last thing that we looked at from an effectiveness standpoint was the upkeep of the control framework. Have things changed in the cyber world in the last 5 years, in the last 4 years, in the last 3 years, in the last year? How was life in the world of cybersecurity prior to Bitcoin? Did we deal with things like ransomware as much? Do we deal with it now? Do we feel like our control framework needs to keep up with it and should be updated at cyber speed? Probably. So on the low end is there's no schedule whatsoever. Whenever everyone agrees, we make a change. And that's where we were at. We had a set of questions that we gave to all of our business associates. And when I asked, how often do we review it and update it? Well, not really. It's just John put it together 3 years ago, and that's that. Well, I think things have changed in the last 3 years. I think things have changed in the last year. We probably should have updated that. Where would we like to be? There should be a regular cadence that's commensurate with evolving risk. And if things are changing slowly, maybe it's okay if it gets updated every 2 years. If things are changing fast, maybe it should change every year. So PCI DSS, I believe, changes every 2 years. ISO 27000, I think, changes every 5 or 6 or 7 years. NIST changes every 4 or 5 years. Does it feel like those standards are changing at the same pace as the cyber risks are evolving? That's a question you have to ask for your specific organization. The second theme that we said we would address is that of efficiency. So this was the question that I believe Mike asked around cost. And so who should bear the cost? Is it the third party that you see on the x-axis, or is it the enterprise, the relying party, the customer, on the y-axis? So this is how it worked for us, is most of the cost was to the enterprise. We bore most of the cost to make sure that our third party was secure, which quite honestly seems backward. Wait, if I'm paying you money to deliver a service, why should I pay even more money to make sure you're delivering it properly? You should be able to demonstrate to me in a compelling, credible, and believable way that you are adequately protecting my data. It should not be more effort on my part to buy services from you. You're just making this a much worse customer experience for me. Where would we like it to be? In the bottom left corner. We want the cost to us to be low as the enterprise. We also want the cost to the business associate, to the third party, to be low. Why do you think that is? Why wouldn't I just have said, hey, I want the cost of the enterprise to be low, and I want all of the costs to go to the business associate?
Because you're going to end up paying for it anyway.
You'll end up paying for it anyway.
It's a managed cost problem for everybody.
Somehow it'll end up coming back to you anyway. Imagine, one of the questions I asked is how many of you are business associates and how many of you are enterprises? So for those of you, so each of you are probably thinking one thing right now. If you're a business associate or a vendor, you're thinking the enterprise should pay it. And if you're an enterprise, you're thinking the business associate should pay it. And for all of you, you're probably 100% certain of who should pay it. But here's the reality. The goal isn't to stick it to the other person or the other entity. The goal is to figure out how we can fix the ecosystem, because the problem is one of the ecosystem and the rules of the road that we've established that don't make any sense, and we've entered into conflict, and we've created an environment, as we'll see in the next slide, where there is an enormous amount of waste. Third-party risk programs, probably 90 to 95% of the money that's spent on third-party risk programs is avoidable. We don't really get much security out of it.
One comment on that, it seems to me, and this is what I'm hearing from my customers, that this challenge is an after-the-fact challenge from a cost standpoint. So, it's like, here's increased cost for doing business with us after you've already priced your service maybe over a multi-year, however it may be working. So I think that's something that's problematic, and I think you're hitting to what needs to be addressed there.
There should be some level of transparency. You don't want to do the bait and switch. That's probably not, if you're a business associate, you probably don't feel good operating a business like that. If you're a customer, you probably don't feel good being serviced as a customer in that way. So that's something that all of us would probably want to avoid. So here's my reality. On the one hand, I was receiving all of these questionnaires, and typical organization our size, it is not uncommon for us to receive a few hundred requests for questionnaires to be completed. It is not uncommon for us to receive a couple of hundred on-site audits to support and to provide SMEs for. But on the other hand, what else are we doing? We're receiving these questionnaires from our customers, and we're also sending these questionnaires to our third parties. So on the one hand, I have my teams coming to me and complaining about this questionnaire that was taken from the SIG, and it's 1,700 questions, and it's such a waste of time. On the other hand, that same team is the one that's sending out questionnaires that don't look much less onerous than that one to hundreds of our third parties as well. And I'm like, do you realize what you're complaining about on here is exactly what you're doing on the other side? So we're both on the give and we're on the take side of it. So it's in my best interest to solve this such that both win. Because if one wins and the other loses, that means I still lose. And the reality is for almost 100% of you, you have customers, and for almost 100% of you, you have customers and you have providers, because that's the way the supply chain works. You've got folks that are upstream from you, your suppliers, and you've got folks that are downstream from you, your customers. And so you want to create an ecosystem where everyone wins and not just one half of the equation wins. And so here's the next piece of it. So this goes to the point that I was making earlier, and out of the 10 criteria that we're going to review, this to me is probably the one that I have personally the most visceral reaction against. So we're going to look at two things here. So on the x-axis, we're going to look at the variety of control requirements across relying parties. So, and on the y-axis, we'll look at the alignment across testing efforts. So low variety of control requirements would mean that all relying parties have identical control requirements. So if there's 5 customers that you're providing services to, we're saying all 5 of those customers give you the exact same set of requirements. That would mean low variety of control requirements. A high variety of control requirements would mean each of your 5 customers has different expectations in terms of how you should keep their information secure. The reality is, if you're delivering services, the same service to 5 customers, you should be able to identify a common baseline set of controls that you deliver that meets the needs of all 5 customers. The way that the industry behaves today is that every customer feels like they're different and they're special. And that simply is not true if you actually look at the data. The other thing that we look at is, now that we've identified the control requirements, we care about the testing of the control requirements, because I will tell you, as a paranoid security person, I don't really care if you've signed a contract that says anything until you prove to me that you've implemented the controls. My blood pressure is probably not going to go down, right? And so how do you do that testing? So a low alignment across testing efforts would mean that each relying party conducts its own test. So if I've said, here are the 5 requirements that I'm going to meet that you have given me, do each of my 5 customers now come on site and validate those same requirements one by one, review the same policies, talk to the same SMEs, review the same firewall logs? Or are they saying, hey, 16 other healthcare payers already looked at this information. Maybe we don't have to be the 17th one to ask you the exact same information. How many of you have multiple audits in a given year? How often do you get asked something unique that you weren't asked in the previous 3 or 5 or 10 audits? Are you just answering the same question over and over again? Yes, someone is reviewing the video camera footage. Yes, we have backups. Yes, we store them for this long. Yes, we store them at a secure location in New Jersey. Yes, we do this. Yes, we do this. And it's the same thing over and over and over again. And after you've expended that amount of time with the auditor, if it was with your customer, you could make the case that, hey, we're building a relationship and we're improving confidence with the customer, and that's worthwhile. But the reality is, it's very seldom your customer that's showing up on site for those audits. They're actually have hired some consulting firm that's sending some auditor on site to do that review. So it's not really helping you build your relationship with your customer either. And at the end of that exchange, at the end of that experience, you don't leave saying, wow, I made my customer happy. Or you don't leave saying, wow, I am so much more secure as a result of that experience. You leave typically saying, I can't believe we just spent 68 hours preparing for that one visit that didn't result in any gain in customer satisfaction, in delivering more customer value, or making us more secure. It just feels like everyone loses when we end up in the top left corner, which is our or when we end up in the bottom left corner, everyone loses. Where we would like to be is in the top left corner, which is that there's not much duplication of testing efforts, and we would also like to end up where the amount of variety across the control requirements is minimal. So everyone's expecting similar requirements, and they're leveraging single testing effort versus 100 customers all coming in and looking at the same system and asking the same questions around it. Total waste of money. You could have used those other 99 assessments, the resources from that, to actually make yourself more secure instead of responding to 99 more questionnaires and audits with the exact same questions. Now, one piece of clarification I want to make here is that this is referring to the control requirements, and it's referring to how you validate those control requirements. This is not saying that everyone should make the same decision, because I could review a set of deficient controls from organization X, and I could say that's acceptable to me. And my peer working for another company who also happens to be a customer could look at that exact same control deficiency and say, absolutely no way. I am going to recommend that we sever the relationship with this third party. They don't have good controls in place. So the decision, what you do with the information when you get it, it is 100% up to the enterprise. It is up to the relying party, because every enterprise has slightly different tolerance for risk depending on their business model. So we're not saying everyone should draw the same conclusions from the data. We're just saying everyone should get the same data and not have to expend additional effort to get it. Under efficiency, the next thing we care about is applicability across multiple industries and geographies. On the left-hand side, we have only applies to a specific organization. That's where we were at. On the right-hand side, we have some sort of set of control requirements that apply across all organizations, regardless of size, industry, and geography. At this point, I started to become slightly less utopian, and I said, you know what, if we ended up in the middle, that would probably be fine, because the reality is we're in healthcare, and I really need something that works for organizations that are within my ecosystem. I'm not really super concerned about what manufacturing or energy or media or the government does, because those aren't organizations that I'm dealing with on a regular basis. Last item under efficiency is the ease to implement. So are third parties subjected to bespoke requirements by each enterprise? So if every enterprise is sending out a 500-question questionnaire to their relying party, that doesn't feel like it's easy to implement. On the right-hand side, you have third parties are subject to consistent requirements across all industries. Again, trying not to be nearly as utopian, my desired state was to be somewhere in the middle, which is that third parties are subjected to consistent requirements, at least within the industry. So I was talking to one of the Fortune 10 technology vendors earlier this year, and they said, you know, we have this and we have this and we have this in terms of our certifications. And I said, but none of them work for healthcare. This is what you need to do for healthcare. And they said, yeah, but we have this and we have that. I'm like, well, that's fine, but it doesn't really work for me in healthcare. Give me something that works for me. And it's okay if you don't want to serve the healthcare industry, we can go to a different vendor. But I could tell you that this is the expectation within healthcare. Okay, from a scalability from a coverage standpoint, the first thing that we care about is how scalable is it? Because at the end of the day, if you have 1,000 vendors, which is not really uncommon, how do you make sure that that actually scales? And the way that we looked at it is we said, along the different types of control validation, how does it scale? In our prior state, we were doing no testing for for most of our customers. And then for about 25%, we were actually having them fill out a self-assessment questionnaire. And we had contractual language for all of them. And then for some small percentage, we were actually doing 1-week on-site audits. Where we'd like to be is doing no questionnaires, still keep the contractual language, do very few on-site interviews and validation, and move the majority, or move 100% to the point where we're doing evidentiary review of policies and validations of every single control. That is where we would like to get to in terms of our desired state. How many people have a formal third-party risk program in their organization that they're aware of? Okay. How many of you tier your third-party risk program? So you've got your tier 1 vendors, tier 2 vendors, tier 3 vendors, right? Almost all of you. So one of the things that I've seen, and when prior to joining Highmark, I was at Verizon, so I spent time working with a lot of enterprises. What I would find very common in enterprises is what they would do is they would tier the vendors based on the amount of money that they're spending with them. So if you had a large relationship with an organization, they would automatically end up in the top tier. If you had a small relationship with an organization in terms of the dollar value of the contract, they would end up in the bottom tier. Now the reality is, from an information risk standpoint, that probably is the exact opposite way of doing it. Because the reality is, if you're working with you have a very large relationship, there's probably a greater chance it's with a larger organization that has a security program that is doing a lot of things. So for me to send someone on site to review Wells Fargo's security program, I'm not sure that that's the best use of my resources, because there's probably 450 organizations that came before me and asked the exact same questions that I would have. However, that small healthcare startup that we're just starting to pilot something with, and we decided to ship 1 million members information to, that has 0 security people, that just started off in their garage, that's probably my #1 risk. And they're not showing up in my model at the top, they're showing up at the bottom. And so it doesn't matter the size of the monetary relationship, it really matters. 2 things matter. How much information are you sending them, and how good are their security controls? So if there's one question I would want to ask my third party or anybody to determine how good of a security program they have, just one question, I'd say, how many people do you have that are dedicated to security? And if the answer is 0, I pretty much know they probably don't care about security as much. If the answer is 2 or 3, that's pretty good. And I'll tell you, the gap between 0 and 1 is huge. The moment you have one dedicated security person, the game totally changes. The leap from 1 to 20 is not nearly as much as the leap between 0 and 1 in terms of the risk reduction. The last thing that we looked at is rate of adoption. Because at the end of the day, we could have a great program, we could roll it out, and it could be the best program in the world, but if it doesn't get adoption, it doesn't really matter. It's not about coming up with the program, it's not about the idea, it's not about the approach, it's not about installing the program, it's all about realizing value from the program. And so adoption would depend on something like, on the low end, if your third parties are totally apathetic to control requirements, they're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to move. Adoption will likely be low. Where we would like to be is on the right-hand side, where third parties desire to adopt due to perceived value of the approach. So they see the value in it and they say, we want to do this, not we've been compelled to do this, we have to do this, we want to do it. We want to get this to desire rather than compulsion. That is where we would like to be. Okay, so what did we do? How did we roll out the program at Highmark, and then where did we end up against those criteria? So this is where I'm actually going to speed things up, because you've seen all the slides, but you're going to see them all one more time with one more sticker added, namely, where did we actually end up? And so before I talk about that, I'll take a second to talk about what approach we took. So we got together with 4 other healthcare payers, HCSC, United Healthcare Group, Anthem, and Humana, and we said, you know what? Why don't we all agree on an approach? Because if we do something individually, it's probably not going to be as effective as if we do something as a group, because then will actually be helping the industry versus adding more complexity. And so we all decided on 3 things. We're going to have our control requirements defined by the HITRUST Common Security Framework. We're going to have our controls must be validated by an approved HITRUST assessor, and our business associates must obtain a HiTrust CSF certification within 2 years. So every single one of those items was extremely deliberate. So the picture became prettier. So let's talk about where we ended up. So we ended up with the HiTrust CSF, which is the most widely adopted security framework is in the US healthcare industry. It's actually based on ISO 27001. There's about an 83 to 84% adoption rate for HiTrust CSF among healthcare payers and among healthcare providers, among healthcare business associates, and among pharma industry, the adoption rate isn't nearly as high, but among payers and providers, the hospitals, the adoption rate is pretty high. So we found something that had pretty high credibility in the healthcare industry, so it worked for that. It doesn't necessarily have credibility across all industries, but that's starting to change. The next thing we cared about is the selection of required controls. And the way that the HITRUST CSF works is it's a risk-based control framework, and it actually maps to 20 different compliance requirements and authoritative documents. So if you're concerned with NIST, you're concerned with some of the other CMS requirements, PCI, HIPAA, high-tech, various state privacy laws, ISO 27001, NIST 800-53, NIST Cybersecurity Framework, FFIEC requirements, and probably about 8 or 10 others. HITRUST essentially harmonizes them. It doesn't come up with something new. It just takes a lot of those existing compliance requirements and build crosswalks against them. The one thing that it does that makes it fairly unique is it introduces something called risk factors. So the idea is if you're a smaller organization, you're only dealing with 50,000 protected health information records versus you're a large organization, you're dealing with 50 million protected health records. You're a small hospital with 20 beds, you're a big hospital with 300 beds, you're a global company that's doing business all over the world, you're a local company that's not doing business all over the world, you happen to be a contractor of CMS delivering business for Medicare and Medicaid, you're not doing it. All of those factor into determining what controls you have to abide by. So if your risk is high, regardless of whether you're small or large, you're going to end up with a higher set of control requirements. If your risk is low, you'll end up with a lower set of control requirements. So every single control, you actually determine what level you have to comply at. So for a password, you may have one organization may be able to get the checkbox for HITRUST by having a 6-character password. Another organization may have to have 2-factor authentication to meet the strong password requirement based on the risk factor. So it aligns and it sizes based on the actual context of the organization. Efficacy of control validation. In order to achieve the HITRUST certification, an approved CSF assessor must validate every single control, and the recertification happens every 2 years. Upkeep of the control framework. And I apologize that information hasn't been updated. We're in 2017. We're up to version 9 of the HITRUST CSF. Version 10 will be coming out next year. Every single year, consistently, HITRUST has updated the Common Security Framework based on feedback from the industry, from the auditors, from the assessors, from the government. And so it does evolve based on the needs of the industry. From a cost standpoint, we end up in the low section because enterprises avoid costs associated with on-site assessments, and the third party has to complete a single validation audit. So instead of a third party like us having to support 100 on-site audits for our customers to come on site, we just have to do one on-site audit every 2 years, and we share that information with all of our customers. From a waste standpoint, we're not exactly in the top left corner, but we significantly make it better because we do reduce the amount of testing effort. So there's not nearly as much duplication of testing efforts. The testing is actually done once versus the testing being done multiple times. And the reason that it still appears in the low medium when it comes to the x-axis is because of the risk factors. So the risk factors mean one organization may have a slightly different set of controls than another organization. Applicability across multiple industries. The H in HITRUST stands for healthcare. So it is really focused on healthcare specifically, but it also gets some of the adjacent industries because of the work HITRUST did after about 2 years of effort working closely with the AICPA. And for those of you that know the AICPA, they are very, very meticulous, very detail-oriented, which is another way of saying they don't necessarily work very fast. And so after 2 years of working with the AICPA, they indicated that the HiTrust CSF controls were actually reasonable controls that could be used as part of the SOC 2 reporting framework as the control requirements in the SOC 2. And so now you can actually get a SOC 2 based on the HITRUST controls. So if I go to one of my customers that's in the financial services industry or manufacturing or energy, and I say to them, I've got a HITRUST certification, they'll look at me and they'll say, we don't even know what that is. Now I'll work to educate them, and over time, many of them understand what it is, and not only do they accept the certification, but I have one very large financial services customer that is a top 10 bank in the country that actually went and got HITRUST certified because they liked the framework so much. Financial services went and got HITRUST certified. And I said to them, you realize the H in HITRUST stands for healthcare, and you're in financial services. They said, yes, but it works for us. Now, so when I go to them and say, hey, I've got a SOC 2 that's aligned to the HITRUST requirements, then they say, I know what a SOC 2 is, I will accept that. What I also tell them is you shouldn't just accept any SOC 2 because there's good SOC 2s and there's not so good SOC 2s. There's an organization I had the opportunity to work with where their salesperson had in a contract agreed to getting the organization SOC 2 certified. This was 3 years before the organization had any plans to go get a SOC 2. And so that gives you an idea of when you're working, when you're dependent on contractual requirements, how effective that is, because in this case, this organization told their customer, which happened to be one of the state governments, that they would go and get their SOC 2, and their compliance, legal, or their security team did not even know about this agreement that they had made to their customer, and the customer's thinking they're going to go get their SOC 2. They had to scramble, and they had to go get their SOC 2 a year before they planned to do it, and guess how long it took them to go get their SOC 2? 6 weeks. Why? Because it's a SOC 2. A SOC 2 is open to interpretation. I can give you a SOC 2 that's crap, or I can give you a SOC 2 that's awesome. So in this case, this same organization said, if my customer really wants something, I can turn something around in 6 weeks and meet their needs, and all they wanted was to check in the box. They got their SOC 2 done in 6 weeks without a single qualification. The reality is that organization did not feel like it had the right controls in there. And so a year later, they went and got their next SOC 2, and the controls that were in that SOC 2 were probably 10 times more effective at reducing risk than that initial SOC 2. That gives you an example of how good the SOC 2 is or isn't. The reality is most of your customers out there live and die by the SOC 2 and they'll accept it. Well, as organizations get savvier, they're going to start to say, well, wait a minute. What's inside the SOC 2? What does your control requirements look like? If it's based on something like the HITRUST or some other well-curated and well-thought-out set of controls, then that's great. If not, then that's going to be questionable. So in our case, we get the SOC 2 because that's the branding some of our non-healthcare customers are looking for, and we get the HITRUST because honestly, that is what makes me feel good, and if we had anything less than that, I really wouldn't be able to stand in front of my customers and look them in the eye and say, we're doing a good job securing your information, and here's proof. Efficiency, ease to implement, and so from a HITRUST standpoint, our approach, 5 large health plans partner to convey consistent and easy to understand requirements. And among us 5, we actually had 7,500 third parties that this requirement went out to. And by aligning to SOC 2, HiTrust CSF has some applicability beyond healthcare. The requirement there is easy. There's no 16-page amendment to the contract that says here's the security requirements. It's you just have to go get HiTrust certified. The requirements get updated every year. Every 2 years, you have to go get recertified. We don't have to update our contracts every year because now there's a new cyber threat out there. That is all taken care of. From a coverage standpoint, we talked about having scalability, and we get to the top right corner, which is the number one thing I was looking for, and that is that for 100% of my third parties, I want to have an evidential review of policies and validation of every single security control. Why was it important for me to get to 100%? Because after years and years of trying, I still had very, very low confidence in our ability to accurately tier our vendors. And a vendor may start out small and low risk. 6 months, a year from now, the nature of that business relationship could change. They could lose their security team. They could defund their security. I'm not going to know what's happening. I'm not going to feel good about the tiering of my third parties. So I don't want to rely on that. I just want to assume that someone else is going to go do that for me. And by doing the HiTrust certification, I get that. If you're low risk, your control requirements are going to be low. If you're high risk, control requirements are going to be high. And I just want 100% of my vendors to be HiTrust certified. Otherwise, I don't feel comfortable going to my customers and saying, trust us, we're on it. The last thing that we looked at was, from a coverage standpoint, was adoption. The third party's desire to adopt due to perceived value of approach. And we got there because of the approach that we took. And back to the conversation that I had earlier, which is, it isn't something that we're doing to them. It is something that we have to look at both the side of the enterprise and the relying party and make sure it makes sense for everyone, because we're on both sides of it and we need it absolutely to make sense. And to date, the vast majority of our third parties see the value and approach and have committed to it. There's one vendor that it was escalated to me, and I had to have about 2 or 3 conversations with them to say, why aren't you getting HiTrust certified? And if you really aren't, let me know, because then we need to start making plans to stop doing business with you, because we were serious. And they came back to me in spring of this year and said they are going to go and get HiTrust certified, and they've already selected an assessor. So finally, if this is going to be successful, there's 3 things that are extremely important. One is it needs to have continued broad support across the industry. If this is something that's seen as Highmark is doing and 4 other payers are doing, this is going to fizzle away. And so at this point, there's probably close to 90 or 100 organizations out there that have done the same thing that the 5 of us did to begin with, and they have now required all of their third parties to be HiTrust certified. In fact, I have received letters and had to sign letters that were the same as the ones that I had sent when we started this program, where our customers are telling us we are now going to have to be HiTrust certified. Good news is we got HiTrust certified 2 years ago, so for once we're ahead of what our customers' expectations are. Organizations are convinced that it's here to stay. If they think that this is just the flavor of the month and it's going to go away, they're not going to make an investment in it. This is here to stay, and I can tell you that because I'm now starting to see a lot of demand and growth from financial services industry. And I'm starting to see it from the technology sector and for other areas where they aren't in healthcare, they don't have protected health information, but they're looking at this framework and saying, this is what we want to do, and this is what we're going to use. And next year when the new framework comes out, you'll see a pretty significant change in the framework that's going to make it broader and not nearly as healthcare specific, and it'll become industry agnostic. And then the last piece is that both the relying parties and the third parties need to not only perceive, but they need to realize value. And if they're not realizing the value, the costs are going down, the audits are going down, the questionnaires are going down, it absolutely won't work. To date, we're seeing it work because organizations are seeing that. I just polled my team in just the month of September, we had 3 questionnaires that we were able to go back to our customers and say, hey, we've got this HITRUST certification. Your questionnaire is down here. Our certification's up here. Do you really want us to respond to your questionnaire, or would you like the 300-page report from HITRUST based on an on-site audit that lasted 3 months? In all 3 of those cases, they said, forget about the questionnaire, just send us the report. That is value right there. Because guess what? Those those customers, when I complete that 100, 200, 300 question questionnaire, what do you think they have to do with it? They have to go through the results, and they have to go manage it, and they have to come up with a corrective action plan, and they have to do remediation, they have to do all of that work, or they could just say, give me your HITRUST report, which already has the corrective action plan, and I'll follow up with you in a year or 6 months. Now we've solved it, now we've reduced our costs. Okay. Do we have time for questions, or are we about done?
Probably handle the questions in the panel session at the end.
Perfect. No more time for questions, so. Which is why we asked them before we started, because I promised we wouldn't have time for questions at the end. So at least I didn't lie about that. Okay, well, thank you very much.
So now we'll do a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back here, and we'll hear from Tom Norman, who's going to talk to us about cybersecurity and its impact on the healthcare industry, both things we've seen and things we haven't yet seen, but are on the horizon. So be back in 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, everybody, please take your seats. We're going to head back into it. We are starting in 30 seconds.
Okay, we are ready to go? Well, good afternoon. My name is Joel Wolverton with Veeam Software, and I wanted to first off say, Omar, thank you very much for the information that you talked about earlier. Looking forward to the panel discussion later on to take care of maybe some of the other questions that everybody's had. But before we get to that, I am with Veeam Software, and Evolve IP is a platinum cloud provider of ours. And we're very happy and we're glad that we're here today. And thanks for the opportunity really to help sponsor this, because I think there's a lot of great information being passed on. Evolve IP definitely leverages Veeam from a backup and replication standpoint. And with that has given us the opportunity really to work with them as a platinum partner. So we thank them for that. But with that, I was asked to introduce today Tom Norman, who is here. He is an international cyber security expert working with Ingram. And he's going to talk to us a little bit more about the what's going on out in the World Wide Web. Before I turn it over to you, Tom, I just wanted to say a point that kind of came up last night. Had an opportunity to have dinner with Omar and Tom and other folks from Evolve IP. And with those discussions, really did open up my eyes to, and we all know it, right? What's going on from a security standpoint, World Wide Web, dark web, deep dark web. There's a lot of scary stuff going on out there. And with that, I was really anxious to hear a lot more about really what we should be paying attention to on this front. So with the explosion of the attacks that are going on from a cyber security perspective, I'm really looking forward, Tom, to your discussion on different ways that we need to really open our eyes and make sure we're putting in the right precautions to make sure that these cyber attacks don't happen, which I know isn't easy. Last thing is that I just wanted to pull out the compelling case for unifying IT and physical security. I've noticed everybody's kind of looked in their bag, but there's some neat stuff in here from what's going on in the world and some of the things that you've worked on, Tom. So I'm sure to give us some background on that today. So thank you very much, and look forward to hearing more from you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
How are you? Good, good. First, I want to kind of warn you, I don't give a conventional presentation. So you'll see that shortly. Just a little bit of background on myself. I've been with Ingram Micro. I don't know how many folks in the room know who Ingram Micro is. It's the largest distributor of IT and IT security equipment in the world. It's about a $50 billion corporation, presence in 131 countries. And I was very honored about a year and a half ago to be asked to work with them as their global cybersecurity consultant. Prior to that, I had about 35 plus years as an independent security and anti-terrorism consultant, 20 of those years working out of Beirut, Lebanon, covering the Central and Northern Africa, the whole Middle East, the Gulf states, South Asia, and a bit of Southeast Asia, the southern Philippines, island of Mindanao, and so forth. I've written about 11 books and research papers. You have one of the research papers there. And this book up here, oops, sorry, go back. Yes, we'll come back. There we go. This book up here won Security Industry Book of the Year in 2016. So, getting right into this, let's get off to a good start. This is Fluffy. Fluffy is a lovely little dog. However, she has very limited vocabulary. She basically only ever says two things. She says, I like that, or I don't like that. There will be a quiz. All right, so we'll come back to Fluffy later. So we're going to talk initially about how major cybersecurity incidences can evolve and how events that are in the news can result in the background in a major cybersecurity incident. We're going to talk about an incident that's in the news right now. And so beginning with this, this particular crisis we're going to talk about all began with this. This is a Samar cruise missile, and it's made in Iran. It's a guided missile capable of hitting a specific building at a specific range. And these were given by Iran to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And so the Israelis were somewhat concerned about this, particularly in light of the fact that these can be nuclear tipped. So this is a problem for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and also for Israel. So both of these countries are quite concerned about this. That's a little bit of background. And they're concerned basically because of the regional geopolitics. So if we take a look over here, I'm sorry my pointer doesn't work at both screens simultaneously. If we take a look over here, here's Iran, this is Iraq, Syria, Jordan, there is Lebanon right up there, that's Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen down here, and Egypt is over here. So recently in the news for about the past year or so, Saudi Arabia has been essentially at war with the Houthi rebels down in this part of Yemen. And some things have happened recently that have escalated that. We'll talk about that in a second. Now you'll notice up here that all these red countries are aligned with Iran. All the blue countries are aligned with Saudi Arabia. And Lebanon used to be non-aligned, like Oman and Israel. However, over the last 5 years or so, they have become increasingly more aligned with Iran. So that's a concern to Saudi Arabia. Last week, this gentleman, whose name is Saad Hariri, is the current prime minister, well, was the former prime minister of Lebanon up until last week. So the Saudi Crown Prince requested Saad Hariri to come and pay him a visit last week, which he did. And while he was there, he was kidnapped by Saudi officials. Wow, that's remarkable. And he was forced to resign as the Prime Minister of Lebanon. So, which he did. So this began to create an international incident. Now, why would they do that? Well, there are three major factors in Lebanon, factions in Lebanon. There is the Sunnis, which and he is the head of the Sunni faction. There is the Shia faction, and Hezbollah is the head of that faction, basically. And then there is a Christian faction, which used to be very predominant and now has kind of receded in importance. And so with him out of the way as the prime minister, Saudi Arabia felt that they could make a statement that Lebanon is completely aligned with Iran, and therefore have a pretense for going to war. Now, you have to understand, countries don't usually like to fight wars, okay? Because, you know, kill people and break things. And so what they like to do instead is designate somebody else to be the area where the war will be fought. Let's not fight it on our soil, let's fight it on somebody else's soil. And who wants to volunteer for that? Usually Lebanon. And so The Houthi rebels, remember, in Yemen, last week also launched a Qaem-1 missile at Saudi Arabia's Riyadh airport. That's one of the Qaem-1 missiles. It's a long-range, very accurate missile, and it was targeting the Riyadh airport. The Saudis didn't like that. And so they used an American anti-missile defense system, shot this down very close to the airport. And so you can see things kind of bubbling up. So now we have the prime minister has been kidnapped and he's resigned. We have this missile being fired, so there's escalation. And so let's move forward and presume that a war begins. One of the major areas of my consulting for years was predictive threat analysis. So right now we're going to do some predictive threat analysis. Won't necessarily go this way, but this is one way that it could go. So let's just suppose that Israel buys into the idea that Lebanon is now completely aligned with Iran, and so they begin a war with Lebanon in order to really fight a war with Iran. And that's the beginning of that. So they start off by bombing the airport, the Beirut International Airport, and they sink a vessel at the entrance to the port of Beirut. They blow up fuel storage all over the country. They destroy power plants and water plants, and also destroy bridges all over the country. Now, the net effect of all this in a country like Lebanon is that you've destroyed the electrical system, you've destroyed the water system, and you've destroyed the communications system, and you have destroyed the ability of individuals to go outside of their neighborhoods by destroying bridges. And Lebanon is a country with many, many bridges. So when you bomb significant key bridges, it makes it very difficult for people to move around the country. And so this is all very bad for Lebanon. So enter then HezbollahCyber.com. How many people here knew that Hezbollah has a cyber army whose specific role is to attack enemies of Hezbollah? So this is a convention of some of Hezbollah's cyber army. That's a lot of people. And every single one of these guys sits behind a desk 8 hours a day doing their job, which is cyber warfare. How many people here knew that Hezbollah is at war with the United States of America? Surprise. So these guys become very active. They have kind of a bad attitude about this sort of thing. So this is a screenshot from Hezbollah's cyber warfare. We are oppressed but not weak. We are waiting for you. Come with all your Israeli and USA made weapons. The message is short but clear. That's in Arabic, but anybody in the room can translate Arabic? In a nutshell, it says, you're toast. So once Hezbollah begins a cyber warfare, then Iran gets in the act, and Iran also has a cyber army, similar or larger in scope to that of Hezbollah, and they're also capable of very terrible, devastating attacks. We'll talk about some of those attack vectors in a few minutes. And then Russia, when the U.S. starts to fight back against the cyber warriors, as the NSA certainly would, Russia gets into the act, and they begin to perhaps escalate it from simply cyber attacks into cyber physical attacks. This is an example of a cyber physical attack. In 2014, the first cyber assassination occurred in Italy. It was reportedly was a mobster against whom there had been an assassination attempt, and it was a failed assassination attempt. So he ended up in an ICU, in an intensive care unit, where the assassination was completed using an infusion pump, which was hacked. Well, that's comforting. So this is the sort of thing that Russia has talked about doing. So our context again, we have Iran, we have Iraq, we have Syria, we have Saudi Arabia, we have all these countries who are at odds with each other. And we can see how a small event can rise up to become a major international cyber war. So let's take a look at a few healthcare security attack vectors and what this would mean. So this is all from the Center for Internet Security. So the number one threat against healthcare is ransomware. Also data breaches, distributed denial of services attacks, insider threats, and business email compromises and fraud scams. So those are the major attack vectors. If we take a look at who the potential attackers are against healthcare, we have number one. I'm just going to name these off, and we'll take a kind of a vote and see who thinks number one is. So we have private individuals who are upset and may want to make a statement. We have hacktivists, hackers who have an activist agenda. We have organized crime. We've certainly seen some of that. And then we have state-sponsored attackers. So number one attack vector, in the back of the room, we have a vote. State-sponsored is correct. Who in the room also thought that state-sponsored is the number one attack vector against healthcare? Very good. Most rooms wouldn't think that. They would tend to think it's organized crime. Organized crime is actually number two. And hacktivists are number three, and individuals are a very, very distant number four. So we'll talk more about state-sponsored here in just a couple of minutes. So let's look at each one of these. So we have ransomware, and an example of this was the ongoing cyber war, which has been going on since the original attack, since Ukraine's government fell in 2013. The state of Russia and its contractors, hey, we have contractors. The state of Russia and its contractors have been conducting a cyber war against the country of Ukraine, against the economy of Ukraine, and against every single sector of the economy, including its healthcare sector. And so many, many hospitals in Ukraine have been taken down such that they have to operate with paper records and you know, in some cases without power. That's a monumental risk. Who here in the room thinks that Ukraine is the only potential target by Russia for these kinds of attacks? Nope. No takers on that. Absolutely correct. In fact, the general assessment is that Ukraine has been a practice area for cyber war by Russia, and this has been very, very closely watched by every single country's cyber war teams. Every major country has its own cyber warriors in Ukraine analyzing every single attack that's coming, and you know what types of software they're using, what kinds of methods and tactics they're using. Because at the same time that the Russians are refining their cyber war processes, everybody else is learning by those at the total expense of the government and people of Ukraine. So one of those was an attack called NotPetya. It was called NotPetya because it was not Petya. Petya was a previous piece of ransomware that had gone out commercially, and the Russians pushed out an attack called NotPetya through a piece of accounting software. They literally embedded it in an update that was going out from the accounting software company, and when they pushed out their update, they infected every single computer that uses that accounting software with Petya NotPetya ransomware. And it was a progressive piece of ransomware which then infected every network that it touched. And by the end of a few days, we had hundreds of thousands of computer systems around the world affected by NotPetya. And so that was a very severe piece of ransomware. It took many, many hospitals, healthcare clinics down. Here's another, a direct attack in June of last year against Ukraine hospitals, in which the hospitals themselves were, their own systems were attacked in Ukraine. Here's another one. Martin Gottesfield, who was with the group Anonymous as a hacktivist group, was charged over a hospital distributed denial of services attack. So we've seen that they can use that sort of thing as well. And also insider threats, which are really the worst of each of these, because insiders have direct access to much, in some cases, the entire system. We had a case in 2016 in which the chief IT administrator of Guitar City, I don't know if Guitar City is a major music retailer, went on the dark web advertising his credentials for sale to his company. And luckily, he had Guitar City had an IT provider that had a presence on the dark web. At that time, it was exceedingly unusual. After this event, it became much more common. And in fact, I believe that Evolve IP is looking at that capability if you don't already have that. So they found in a kind of a daily search of their clients on the dark web, found a flag for Guitar Center. They went in, took a look at it. Oh my goodness, we know this guy. And so they placed a phone call to the CEO of Guitar Center and said, we need to have a talk this morning. It's very, very important. He said, what's it about? He said, can't tell you. It's extremely important. He said, well, I don't really have time for it. Yes, sir, you'll have time for this. So he made time for a brief discussion, brought him in. They showed him the screenshots from the dark web, showed the information, and right there from his office, they called the FBI, and an arrest was made that afternoon. So these kinds of things coming from the inside are really just absolutely devastating. So that's a major concern. Also, business email scams and attacks. Here's a case where employees sued a home health care provider after a phishing breach. An HR worker allegedly fell for business email compromise scam. So when we tend to think of an employee clicking on a URL in an email as having a profound effect on that organization, you have to understand it also can have a profound effect on all of their clients and their employees. And in this particular case, employee personal identifying information was compromised, and the employees of the organization sued the organization for that compromise. So this kind of thing can happen as well. So after seeing all of this, who feels a little bit like this guy? This is a scene from the movie Hero, in which at the end of the movie, the hero has just had a conversation with the Emperor of China, and he steps outside the Emperor's palace into the great courtyard of the Forbidden City, and as he steps out, 15,000 arrows are fired at him. So, you know, that's not a good day. Many of us can kind of feel like this person. So, you know, over here on this side, we have IT threats. Over here on this side, we have IT countermeasures. It's all can be very confusing. It's difficult to get context on all of this and to understand, you know, where do I put all this information? How do I hang all this information into a construct that I can make any sense out of? So in any event, this is fluffy. Fluffy is a lovely little dog, and she has a limited vocabulary, and today she says, I don't like that. So in the last 2 years, threat scenarios have changed from something that we should do to something that we absolutely must do. We have to deal with these competently. The new scenarios have become existential threats to all SMB businesses. Literally 20%, according to Malwarebytes' own records, 20% of the SMB customers who have had ransomware attacks against them are out of business 6 months after the attack happens. And that's typically because it takes them so long to recover from the ransomware that their customers go elsewhere and they never come back. So these really are existential threats. And they're very bad threats to large organizations. Target, from their 2014 attack, the final bill for that attack is still not in, and it has already exceeded over $500 million. So just absolutely devastating results from these kinds of things. So we have to be ready. So security, however, can be very, very confusing. We get a lot of mixed messages in the media and from different sources. What should we do? There doesn't seem to be a real sensible plan out there across the entire industry. You know, we have certain anxieties. How can I be sure that I'm doing the right thing? What will happen if I get it wrong? So there's a few things that we have to know. Number one is this. I come out of the anti-terrorism industry as a background, and the thing that we're most concerned about in that industry is something we call boom. Boom is bad. Boom is the security incident. But boom is just a moment on a security timeline. And if we look at that timeline, we have, come back here. We have over here a period called left of boom, which is the period of time before, that we have for prevention and preparation. And over here, after the incident boom, we have right of boom, which is the period of time for mitigation and recovery. So just out of a few quick questions here, who knows what the cost ratio is typically between, for an IT cyber incident, between left of boom and right of boom? 5 to 1, raise your hand. 10 to 1. Okay, we have one over here. 20 to 1. I'll go 20. One back here. 30 to 1. 50 to 1. Hands up? Okay. The actual range of these, and it varies widely, but the actual range is typically anywhere from 20 to 1 to 50 to 1. So that means if the cybersecurity solution over here, the prevention plan, would be maybe $100,000, then over here on mitigation and recovery, we can expect that to run in the order of $2 to $5 million. So it pays to get prevention right. So we don't want to be caught by unexpected intruders. Not these guys. Certainly not these folks. And especially not this one. Because when they come in mass. And it's overwhelming. So I have been talking for a decade about IT security and have been saying something that up until very recently people thought was quite remarkable, and that is that I believe that IT security should be built around a compliance standard. And if IT security compliance failures can have organizational ending consequences. HIPAA jail terms can be very large, up to $100,000 per month per site, going back to the beginning of the incident, of the intrusion. PCI DSS compliance can have very high compliance. HITRUST can help. Why do I like HITRUST? I like HITRUST because of the things about it that are not obvious at all. And the chief thing about that is that HITRUST is a compliance envelope that can contain all of the processes that we use to resolve security projects, and all of the compliance standards. HITRUST is unique in that it's a single construct that can handle PCI DSS, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, GLBA, European standards, and even standards for school healthcare records. So it's a single organizational standard that works across virtually any vertical: healthcare, retail, education, and government, military. It can be used for anything. And I think HITRUST also works in a 10-point plan that I have been talking about for a long time. And I'm just going to go through that real quickly. Point number one, and I think a program like this, in conjunction with HITRUST, gives a very, very high assurance of success. So one, begin in the C-suite. And why do we do that? I talk to a lot of CIOs who tell me that they own the data. And I'm very disappointed to say that I have to disagree with them. They don't own the data. They own the basket that the data is contained in. Who owns the data? The people who get penalized when it all goes bad. So that's the C-level executives. And they're the only people who can write the check. So I ask a CIO, can you write a check to fix this? And he says, no, I have to go up. Then you don't own the data. So the only person who really owns the data is the guy who can write the check. So we also want to get the C-suite to name a Chief Security Compliance Officer. And why do we want that? Number one, so that they have direct visibility into the compliance process. They're not doing the compliance, they're just having visibility into the process because they're the guys who are responsible, right? And also because this gives the team an advocate in the boardroom, so it's very important. And then secondly, we want to look at our obligations for data protection. What are the compliance standards that we have? State, federal, and contractual compliance standards like PCI DSS. And what are the assets that fall under those compliance standards? Do we have a laptop computer with unencrypted data sitting on the passenger seat of my vehicle as I run into the gas station to get a cup of coffee? That's a HIPAA violation. Okay? That's exactly how 500,000 VA healthcare records were stolen in 2008, by the way. So number three, current threat assessment. Who are the current threat actors? What scenarios are they using? What are the next generation of threats that are just over the horizon? This is an example of a cat that is not correctly assessing his vulnerabilities. The cat is looking at this bird and said, you know, I've taken down a few sparrows. This looks like a great dinner to me. And the bald eagle is saying, uh-huh, all right if you want. So this is going to be a bad day for the cat. So we have to be aware of our vulnerabilities. If we can't measure it, we can't manage it. Number four, and this is something highly unusual, and honestly I haven't seen any construct do this, but I think it's absolutely essential. Let's estimate our potential consequences. What would happen if we lost access to all of our data for an hour, for a day, for a week? What would happen if we lost our data to WikiLeaks or to our competitor? What would happen to our business reputation if this gets out into the news? What would our direct mitigation and compliance penalties be? All of these numbers can be estimated competently by the risk manager sitting down with the CIO and with the service provider. These numbers then come out of the organization itself. They're not numbers being pushed off to the organization. But it's important to have these numbers because the C-suite needs financial metrics. They're about making financial decisions. They need financial metrics to compare the cost of the countermeasures program to the cost of potential losses. It's not a return on investment calculation, but it's its direct equivalent. It's a return against potential future losses, so that's essential. Number five, take a selfie, define our security vulnerabilities, network security audits, security assessment, evidence of previous breaches if possible. And number six, perform a gap analysis. And number seven, an IT security implementation program, thank you. And then implementing that plan in a phased approach, testing each implementation, backing out something if we need to. And then number 9, training and testing on the hardware, on the software, and on configurations, and training the end users who are really the first firewall. We have to teach them what not to click on. And then number 10, reiterative processes here. So a good cybersecurity program can improve security, we would expect that. It can enhance employee and patient safety. It can also improve patient record privacy. It can provide organizational stability, and it can provide operational efficiency above systems that don't have good cybersecurity, because systems that have poor cybersecurity typically run slower than systems with very good cybersecurity. A lot of folks think it's the opposite, but it's actually true. And it can improve operational performances. So all of those things are goals for every single healthcare provider that we know. So this is Fluffy. She is a lovely little dog. She does have a limited security vocabulary, and today she says, I like that. All right. When it comes, it'll come in mass. And so we want to be ready for anything. We've got time for maybe just two quick questions. Yes, sir.
The Chief Security Compliance Officer, do you see a CISO reporting in through that?
Yes, that's correct. And so basically, he's an individual in the boardroom who has direct access to finances. I'll tell you who I think the Chief Security Financial Officer ought to be, is the Chief Legal Counsel for the organization, because he's the main advocate for controlling risk in the organization. Another question? Back here, yes.
Equifax was the last one. It was a big case that came out in cybersecurity, and it's going into Congress. Is there anything you know about the case that could have helped those guys?
Okay, the question was about Equifax. Is there anything that I know that could have helped Equifax? Yeah, pretty much just everything. That Equifax is a colossal example of phenomenally bad planning for IT security. It's just absolutely every conceivable thing that could go wrong went wrong with Equifax, including up to the event, the recovery for the event, and then the selling of stocks after the event. No problem there. So the biggest problem with Equifax, in my humble opinion, and it's just my opinion, was that, and this is an issue in healthcare in general, is that the customer is not, or the patient is not the customer. Okay? Sound like a familiar problem? And it's the same thing with Equifax. We are all the source of the data for Equifax, and yet we're not the customer. None of us volunteered that data. We didn't sign any agreement. There's no end user agreement that we signed with Equifax or any of them. And so Equifax is a canary for that whole, canary in the coal mine for that whole situation. I was very, very disappointed to see Congress rule that Equifax could not be sued in a class action lawsuit by the people whose data it held. I think that's an outrage, but that's, again, just a personal opinion. So one last question, and then we have to go. Any other questions?
I have a question, actually.
Yes.
Your thoughts on both, since penetration testing is part of the plan?
Yeah, absolutely important. One of the things I really believe in is, two of the things I believe in is penetration testing by a really competent certified ethical hacker. And secondly, is looking for evidence of previous intrusions. That's something that almost nobody does, and I'll tell you, when you come up to a client with evidence of previous intrusions, that is a phenomenally compelling argument for getting a better security countermeasures. But, you know, the Wharton School of Business says if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's not just true for business, it's true for security as well. So, good. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. We're going to take our next 10-minute break. We'll be back for the panel discussion and
good.
Well, that looks like a lineup.
You just need our numbers.
Yeah, I know. Just we'll all hold our numbers like this.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Today, this is our last part of the afternoon, the panel discussion. So I'm going to let Paul Johnson from Whitfleet take it from here. Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to go up till 3:30. We're going to kind of get the roundtables, the panel discussion going with a few prepared questions for the panelists. And then we definitely want to open it up to make sure that I'm sure you have some questions as well that you'd like to ask of the group. So we'll open it up. They'll come around with a microphone toward the end. So real quickly, we'll do introductions here. Paul Johnson, I'm a partner with Whitfleet. We're a CPA and consulting firm, and we're a HITRUST assessor as well. And I lead our healthcare risk services practice, including our HITRUST services. As of course, you know Omar and Tom. Other panelists, Phil Jevin is a Vice President in Technology and Business Development at Universal Printing, an organization that became HITRUST certified last year. And so kind of gone through that process, and Phil has a really good perspective on what that takes to go through that process. We have Tim Bogle, Vice President of Security and Compliance for Evolve IP, who, they have all kinds of compliance requirements as a service provider, and of course they're going through HITRUST as well, so have some experiences with that as well. Next to Tim is Karen Johnston, who is a senior manager at Whitfleet, leads a lot of HITRUST and SOC 2 type of audit engagements there. And last but not least is Doug Manger, who is a senior sales engineer at Fortinet. And so definitely works with a lot of folks in the healthcare space as well as other industries. Okay, so we're going to get it started. I think we're going to actually start at that end with Doug. Doug, in your experience working with a lot of various different types of customers and clients inside the healthcare industry, outside of it, what do you see as some of the key differences or some of the notable things that are different about healthcare organizations? What are some of their maybe challenges or maybe weaknesses that they exhibit that you don't necessarily see in other industries?
Well, I'd say for the sake of differences, and this is just from my experience in healthcare, if you look at the bell curve of adoption of IT or common or current security trends, that healthcare by and large can be a little bit in the delayed category. And it's not a dig, it just is what it is because of some key factors around complexity, risk, and regulation/compliance. And certainly we talk about regulation compliance a lot today. But in looking at, from my experience, healthcare covers a lot of different components. And certainly one of the components we talked about was data and personal data. You've got health insurance, you've got healthcare, you've got hospitals, and intermixed in there, a lot of different systems that are interconnected. And it's a matter of trust, it's a matter of how do we make these components work together, and how does that really pertain to compliance and our risk assessment? Add to that the fact of some political stances within healthcare. In my experience, I've seen that security policy has largely been dictated by physicians, and in certain other verticals, that can be common, but that's where there's some delay, some inherent delay, because we need to be current with our security trends. There can be detractors from that because processes have been built in and people have gotten used to that. So when you propose something to, say, a group of physicians and say, well, we need to, for the sake of compliance and regulation, change the security controls, that can be met with, no way, we're not going to do that, or a lot of pushback. Also add to that the fact that because of the complexity, and this is edging more towards similarities with other verticals, we've seen that throughout the years, because of compliance, because of regulation, and also just inherent security issues. A lot of healthcare organizations have purchased certain point products to address a point issue at a single point in time. So now we have the issue of a key group of people in the IT security space managing a myriad of different point systems, creating a lot of gaps in the infrastructure. And that's where I start to see the differences start to change into similarities between the verticals. Because what we're now seeing is that throughout the years, because of the disparate systems, because they're not communicating effectively enough, and add to that the prime focus on, are we compliant? There's that question that constantly comes up, because compliance, there's a visual response to that, right? You will be compliant or else. There's a punitive approach to that. And apologies if I'm offending anybody here, but with anything punitive, we tend to focus on that. We are 400x magnification there, where we can lose sight of the bigger picture. So where I see some of the similarities in other verticals where we need to focus is more on, are we asking the right questions? Are we compliant? That doesn't always mean, are we secure, right? Now I'm hearing a lot of great things here today about where that's shoring that up. But we need to really comprehensively look at, are we compliant, but also are we secure, and how do we know that, right? Because if we're mired down and solely looking at, are we compliant today, will we be compliant tomorrow? But more importantly, with the advanced sophistication of the threats that we're seeing out there, we need to come back to that idea, the question around, are we secure? So what we're seeing in trends today with healthcare and other verticals is a focus on, are we secure? And if anybody in the audience says, yes, we are, the answer is you're not, because there's no 100% security. But how do we know we're secure? And that's a big component of that is visibility, right? If we don't have comprehensive visibility into the borderless network that is everything now, right? Perimeter firewall is still there, but what's on the outside is bad, what's on the inside is good, no longer applies. Now with cloud, wireless, retail, POS, all of these pieces, we really need to take stock of what is ours and how are we securing the data within that so that we can, in turn, rest assured that we are compliant but also secure at the same time. So a little circuitous, but hopefully that got to the point.
Excellent. Thank you. So next we'll go to Karen. Karen, with regards to, in your role, in terms of assessing organizations against the HITRUST framework, performing SOC 2 exams. With HITRUST you have specific requirements. With SOC 2 you have control objectives or criteria that organizations are striving to address. What are some of the common things that you see that are either misunderstood or common weaknesses or observations in terms of all that assessment work that you've been involved with?
Okay. Well, I mean, it depends. But in many cases, it would be, they're actually an inverse of each other. One is some organizations have great policies and procedures. Management has written these policies and procedures, but the people who are performing the actual control activities, the actual everyday processes, haven't implemented them. And I don't think, sometimes it's because they're not properly communicated, sometimes they're not even available to the people that they're applicable to. So we come in at the beginning, and generally most organizations want to go through a gap analysis. And one of the things we'll ask them is, how are your policies and procedures? And many times, organizations feel that they're not that strong yet, and who wants to write policies and procedures? But they'll end up doing that, or they'll have assistants in writing those policies and procedures, but they're not communicating them to the people who should be, who should know what they're supposed to be doing. Now we have the inverse. They may have really good controls, but they don't have them documented anywhere. With HITRUST, you need all three. You need policies, procedures, and it has to be implemented. So that seems to be the biggest stumbling block, is sometimes we're there and we're looking, because most times we're starting off with policies and procedures because we want to understand the entire environment and what should be in place. And so we're looking at them, we're like, this is great, this is what they needed. They're meeting all the requirements for policy and procedure. And then we go to the testing phase and they're not implemented at all times. And that's surprising for management. And it's a large universe for management to look at, their entire control environment. So they're caught off guard many times for that. Then the opposite. People think they just have great policies and procedures. They know that they have really good controls in place. So we're testing and we're comparing what policy and procedure says to the actual control activity and what's being performed, and they don't match up. So it is a sticky situation, and it's generally a surprise in the middle of the audit. And the best defense for that, I would say, is doing a really open-minded aware self-assessment where you're truly investigating what you're supposed to be doing, what you have documented, and what you are doing. Because unfortunately, in the middle of the audit, it becomes difficult to fix that.
Excellent, thank you. Let's move on to Tim. Tim, now, Evolve as a service provider, I'm sure you're getting all kinds of questionnaires, audits, things like that. So there's this kind of focus on compliance because a lot of them are, from organizations in regulated industries that have their checklist of things that they need to make sure are covered. If the whole point is to actually be secure, how do you kind of balance that compliance with, security, and how does a framework actually help you be more secure?
Yeah. Yes, as you mentioned, as a service provider, we're not stuck with one industry standard. We're stuck with all industry standards that we cover. So, PCI requirements, HIPAA/HITRUST requirements, FISMA, GDPR coming for the EU, and so really what our compliance and security program focuses on is A, to be internally compliant, so selling it internally and maintaining kind of a separation between our internal staff, maintaining good security practices and following policies from what a compliance standard might say, and then being able to rapidly cover compliance requirements that customers require for the variety of roles. So one of the reasons we focused very heavily on HITRUST is it has the capability to cover multiple standards and map to them. So what our strategic direction is to utilize that platform moving forward to be able to provide a standard way for us to complete our yearly compliance certification activities, to be able to provide customers assurance that we really are secure, and at the same time provide them with the evidence they need to maintain their own certification for whatever certification they may have.
Excellent. All right, thank you, Tim. Next, we'll move on to Phil. Phil, as an organization that became HITRUST certified last year, it involved really putting in place a cybersecurity program and really making sure that that's being maintained and that you're managing your security risk. I guess for you, what's been the change in terms of the role of security within your organization, and what do you see the benefits over the last, say, 12 to 18 months?
Well, I mean, as a printing company, a lot of people look at us and you're not going to think that our focus is going to be on cybersecurity. I mean, we're, a vendor for the healthcare industry, though, so that's really what the reality is. We're receiving all of these data files when it comes to enrollment files, claims files, not just for the purpose of the actual, print and mail process, but over the years recently, our clients' requirements have changed in terms of technology needs, compliance needs, where we need that data in terms of reporting back to the clients, in terms of being able to on-demand display an image for a specific individual that went out in the mail. So we have to kind of take a look at our framework and provide those services and really give them the interfaces and the mechanisms that they need and start poking holes in our firewall, more or less. So, it really becomes a necessity to provide that kind of security, to, do all the preventative and proactive security measures that we need to mitigate some of the risks when it comes to those cyber security events, or, I mean, they're not just risks either. I mean, as, Tom mentioned, they're real. There's not just a risk that, that might happen. I mean, we see with the preventative measures that we have in place, we see the logs, we see the blacklist growing as, failed attempts are happening. So it's a real threat that's out there, and it's something that, not just my part of the organization on the technology side is aware of, but, whenever there's an event in the news, I'm guaranteed to get a knock on the door from the CEO the next morning, along with my counterpart there, to say, what was this? Could this have been us? What are we doing to prevent it? So we're able to kind of look at those different items that we have in place and, but it is still, part of the education that, this is the real world. It's something that you are expecting, but, the HITRUST certification specifically helping us put those controls in place, help give us a certain comfort level. We feel comfortable with our clients at that point that we are HITRUST certified. We have a lot of the framework in place to be able to mitigate some of that risk. So we're out there and we see, it's a lot easier as we go through those questionnaires, which are, dwindling away. We had one open recently where it was open for, a couple of years, going back and forth as we go through the final process of the questionnaire. And then finally we got our HITRUST certification. We submit that as a part of the evidence, and within a couple of weeks we're closed and it's done and it's ready to go. And similarly, in the RFP process recently, we actually had a customer that reached out to us, and they specifically, dealing with one of the large champions for HITRUST in the past, their requirement in the RFP was that you had to be HITRUST certified right off the bat. So, it helped us competitively that it kind of eliminated some of our competitors because that was a serious item that they were looking to have on their side.
Excellent. Thanks, Phil. Tom, I think in your talk just previously, going through the 10-point plan of things that you can put in place to make Fluffy happy. So this is good. One of them was really around, having a proactive plan that was built on a framework. HITRUST is one of a number of different frameworks out there. I know, with your past experience, you've looked at a lot of these different frameworks. Can you tell us what your observations are about HITRUST? What makes it different, or how do you compare it to other frameworks, I guess, is the question.
Well, HITRUST is kind of the pinnacle of IT security frameworks. It encompasses essentially every compliance standard that exists today, to the best of my knowledge. And so by complying with HITRUST, we comply not only with all of the compliance standards that the organization may currently be subject to, but any that might be required to be adopted. And we also know that as we interrelate with other types of organizations and other types of businesses, because IT security the exchange of information is very fluid between organizations. I mean, this is a perfect example of, so many organizations just even 5 years ago wouldn't even have a second thought about the organization that does their printing. But it's all those organizations that tie together that really make security work. And so HITRUST is like the common fabric of this.
Thank you. Now, my question for Omar is actually one we didn't get to during his talk that we wanted to, so I'll pose it to you now. Omar, how do you build security into your environment by design rather than it being an afterthought? Can you talk about that?
Sure. So, our organization, one of the first things that I experienced is people would be coming to me and asking me if they could do something. Could engage in business with a vendor? Could they send this information? Could they move this to production? Could they move this to test? All sorts of questions. And I just said, there's no way I'm going to be able to answer all these questions at the velocity that they were coming at me. And I realized what I needed is a risk management program. So anytime those questions would get asked, I would submit it to my team and say, can you go do a risk assessment on this? Let me know what the findings are. Better yet, let the business know what the findings are and coach them through the yes, no. And it's almost never yes, no. It's here's the risks and there's a business decision around whether it's worth accepting or not, depending on the outcomes. And so we did that, and in a typical year, we probably do about 200 or 300 risk assessments. And so that's that many fewer times that those questions get posed to me. So I love that because it frees me up to do other things. But the thing that doesn't help us with is how do we prevent us from taking risks that we shouldn't be taking? How do we build things securely to begin with? And the risk assessment typically looks at something when it's a little bit further down the life cycle. And so that's where security architecture comes into play. So how do we define standards? How do we define requirements? How do we define procedures and guidelines and hand those to the teams that are doing the building? the building of the applications, the building of the infrastructure, the building of the systems, the building of the B2B connectivity, whatever it is that we're building, how do we hand them the list of instructions and the guidelines that say, if you follow these, you will build it more securely. So a great example is in the application space. We probably have close to about 3,000 developers and testers and QA folks all focused on building applications for our enterprise and for our clients. There's no way there's going to be enough people on my team to work hand in hand with each one of them to make sure that we're building applications securely. But if we give them the training, we give them the tools, and now they're building application code securely instead of us coming in at the back end to test it. So we just did some analysis a couple months ago, and we found that over a period of just 3 months, actually just over 2 months this summer, the number of vulnerabilities that we introduced into our code per 1,000 lines of code decreased year over year, and the cost savings to the organization, and the cost in this case is the cost it would have taken to actually fix those vulnerabilities that we would have incurred the year before, was in the millions of dollars. Right, so that sort of gives you a real world example of how you actually build security in, so you build it securely by design, and there's a real outcome. So now when we go to the application development team, what I've said to my vulnerability management manager is, don't go to them and say, you need to build code securely. They kind of care about security, but what they really care about is cost pressure, because that's what their clients keep telling them. And so I've said, go to them and say, hey, if you build stuff securely, you save money. And now they care.
Excellent. Thank you. So Dave has a microphone in the back, and I want to open it up to questions. I certainly have some additional ones that we can ask the panelists here, but we want to hear from you. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and Dave will come around with the microphone. And if you want to direct it at a specific panelist, feel free. Otherwise, we'll field it, and everybody will look at someone else, and we'll try to figure out who will answer it.
I think we're hot. So all of you, I think, could probably take a stab at the question, which is, it sounds like to me HITRUST is overarching for a lot of these competitive frameworks that are out there, but the frameworks are all competing for attention. What's your kind of outlook on how HITRUST might be adopted outside of the healthcare space? And what are kind of like the action items that are going down that path?
Can I take that one? Thanks. This is, because I'm a generalist, this is the thing that's most appealing to me about HITRUST. HITRUST started out in support of HIPAA, but they took a very strategic approach to this and understood that every healthcare organization also has to typically comply with PCI DSS, so that's a very prescriptive process. And as they looked at, say, the NIST framework and ISO 27001, you have this checklist of all of the things that you have to do. And then there's another set of columns over here for which compliance standards does this checklist point align with. And somebody had the bright idea that, well, hey, let's just take the worst case of all of these and make HITRUST comply with the worst case of every compliance standard that we can find that is likely to be, intersected with our client base. And the net result was, and I think it was not an accident, am I correct about that?
Not an accident.
Not an accident. That HITRUST became the go-to solution for compliance. And you were talking about frameworks, so we have basically compliance frameworks, and then we have process implementation frameworks. So process implementation frameworks, NIST, COBIT, ISO 27001, compliance frameworks, all of the various compliances, state, federal, and contractual. And so it is much, much easier to do something that is difficult, that complies with everything that we're going to have to do from every direction that it may come at. Remember the guy with all the arrows? And then it is to do this one and then discover that we have to modify that to accommodate this one, and then we have to modify it again to accommodate that. It's a single best practice approach. And it has the potential to work across every single vertical sector. So military, healthcare, retail, education, government, transportation, distribution, you name it, it looks like HITRUST is going to be, if not today, within the next couple of years, a solution across all of those verticals and across all of the compliance standards that they're likely to run into, including European compliance standards.
So will that feature function set be the overarching
So here,
that makes it happen, or is there a promotion going on as well?
How many of you have ever traveled overseas? Did you take your electronics overseas? Yep. The first few times you traveled overseas, did you notice that your electronics were not nearly as functional when you went overseas? Because what do you need to do differently when you're overseas? Does your plug work in every country? Doesn't. So we could sit here and talk about, is the US plug the best? Or is the British the right one? Or is the Germans have it right? Or did the French have it right? Or the Germans have it right? And so that's sort of the compliance discussion. Is HIPAA right? Is PCI right? Is this right? Is that right? So HITRUST isn't trying to solve that problem of which one of them is right. What HITRUST is saying, you're going to have to comply with many of those. We don't care which ones. You're an international traveler. We're just going to give you a multi-plug adapter. So that's what HITRUST is. HITRUST isn't competing with each of those adapters. It's just saying, we're going to give you a solution that'll work with regardless of which country you're going to find yourself in.
So what you're saying is the promotion of that is really the feature function set.
Yes.
That overarching, and that's what's going to make it work. If everybody looks at it that way, you're just not going to care as opposed to saying, hey, let's make this.
Yeah, and every year they're adding the equivalent of new countries' plugs into the universal plug.
As well as updating existing, those standards don't change either across these various, PCI changes, NIST changes, all these things change on a periodic basis. And so HITRUST is going through adding new adapters, if you will, but also updating the existing ones as well. So you can see how this stuff maps together. And there are dashboards or reports that will show you, if I want to see how I'm doing against the PCI requirements, I can see it in those terms. If I want to see it for HIPAA, for what have you, ISO, those are all things that you can pull out from the framework because of all those mappings.
And let me add in, forgive me, Tim, let me add in one other element, and that is that HITRUST is also looking at emerging threats. And so it's not just dealing with the compliance standards, but rather the threats as they're evolving as well. Tim?
I was just going to say, Omar mentioned it, I believe, in his talk, that there's a concept within HITRUST called factors. So I don't want anybody to be misled that now we're going to just take all the compliance stuff and say, well, now you have to do all of this in combination. That's not what it means. So you can go in there and put in your controls that you have, and then select what compliance things you need, and it will add in controls that are specific to those things. So maybe 80–90% of the controls actually span pretty much every compliance thing you can imagine, but there may be some very specific ones, obviously, for HIPAA. There's very specific healthcare ones. There's very specific things for PCI that wouldn't be included across the board. So you can have a compliance program that doesn't comply with PCI. You can have everything mapped in there, and you can have all your controls, and then suddenly when you need to do PCI, you can go check a box and say, well, now I need this, and it'll basically say, okay, well, 95% of the controls are already in place. Here's the couple that either you haven't documented yet or maybe you don't have because they're PCI compliant. And as things evolve, GDPR is next year, I believe, for privacy, those things just keep getting added in. So things down the road are mapped across your existing framework, and then additional controls are added. But it's not every control you now have to be in compliance with for every single organization, because that would be silly as well.
Question here.
Hold on one sec. For the printer guy, was this
printer guy? That's your new name, Phil.
So was this something that your company was faced with? Okay, our largest customer now says we have to be compliant. We have to go do this. And how long did the process take? And and how much work was it? And how much money did this cost your organization? And I guess the bottom line is, was it done because you needed to do it to continue to do business with this particular healthcare organization?
Well, I mean, yeah, we did get, we received the letter that Omar mentioned that, you know, many of the champions
It works.
sent out. Now, it wasn't Omar specifically, though. He didn't send me the letter. One of the colleagues did, or one of his colleagues at a different company anyway. So, but
the letter works.
The letter worked, yeah. We had our 2-year time frame, and I mean, we took it seriously. We got a message that actually said, hey, you should go down to the HITRUST Third-Party Assurance Summit down in Grapevine, Texas, and we said, sure, we'll go see what this is about. And then I think 6 weeks later, it said, okay, yeah, by the way, you have to get certified. But overall, our process, I mean, a lot of these things, because we were already dealing with the big health payers in the industry, so we were going through all these different risk assessments. So, you know, a lot of those controls, because we had to abide by HIPAA HITECH Act. So, you know, it wasn't like HITRUST was something new. I mean, you know, we were already attesting to the fact that we were doing these things before. So it's not like HITRUST is some new thing that you have to abide by. It's just abiding by the law that's already there, basically. So, you know, when we actually, you know, looked for an assessor, a whole process, you know, might have started in the fall of one year. We selected an assessor by the spring of that year. We started our engagement, doing a joint engagement with a SOC 2 at the time, and we wrapped it up by the end of that year. So, I mean, overall, from the selection to the actual completion, you know, we were looking at maybe 7-8 months or so. So it really wasn't too onerous, just because we had a lot of that built already. You know, that's going to depend, like Karen said, it really depends on what kind of controls you already have in place, where you are in the process, not only in terms of how long, but how many man hours you're going to be taking, how much you have left to implement. Of course, we did have some implementations. It wasn't all, you know, smooth sailing. We had a lot of policy writing to do, but, you know, it really depends. We were in a fairly good spot to begin with, so we were happy to go through that HITRUST certification process just to really, you know, give ourselves a better leg to stand on, like Omar said, you know, being able to use that instead of answering some of the risk assessments, which we're looking forward to, and it's already starting to work for us.
Can I add something to that? I think it's important to note also that HITRUST, you should always do a self-assessment prior to even starting the validated assessment, and that gives you that list of, we've got a lot to do, or we don't look so bad.
Over there.
Yeah, different question, and maybe Omar, maybe Karen. I think the answer is cost, but from everything I heard today, it would be probably not true because it seems to be more efficient. And I doubt it's ignorance because it's a very well-known topic. Why wouldn't a payer or a provider require all their BAs to be HITRUST certified, or themselves?
You know, honestly, I think it's when payers and providers look at the merit and they design a third-party program based being very deliberate about it and look at what things they should have in a third-party risk program, a very natural outcome in most cases would be we absolutely need some kind of third-party validation, whether it's HITRUST or if it is something else. And I think for most organizations, they just haven't taken a close enough and honest look at it. That's one. And in other organizations, the challenge is, and this is particularly the challenge in the financial services world, where it's not atypical for organizations to have 50, 60, 80, 100 people running their third-party risk program. So if I'm running that 100-person third-party risk program and someone tells me, hey, I could just send this letter and get everyone to be whatever certified for financial services, and I could send all my folks home, I would probably believe that that's a good idea, but do you think I'll ever make that decision? Probably not.
You know, I'd say real world right now, we see many of our clients, unfortunately, have the demand for the SOC 2. We have SOC 1, we have a client right now I'm working with just yesterday, SOC 1, SOC 2, and HITRUST, because the word's not out there yet. They're not all clients aren't fully educated on which framework they're confident in relying upon. So unfortunately, if it's an organization like Phil that works in different industries, then different verticals, they could, you know, financial services might have never even heard of HITRUST. So there's still that struggle right now of having multiple requirements on organizations.
Right. And a quick follow-up, is there any discussion with legislation that may require HITRUST as opposed to, say, HIPAA or other regulations? In whatever stage of discussion it might be?
You know, the closest thing is the state of Texas has something called Secure Texas. And if an organization is HITRUST certified, then they essentially get safe harbor. So if there is some sort of a breach or there's some sort of an issue, the state will not levy any fines or penalties for those organizations. There's a lot of talk on the Hill. I've had the opportunity to spend some time with legislators as well, having these discussions. The Congress is very reluctant to call out a single standard and a single requirement, especially if it isn't something that was developed by the government. That's sort of the, that's what makes it a little precarious. Now, one of the things that we do know is we're not aware of a single organization that has been audited, a single HITRUST certified organization that has received an audit from the OCR, which is the law enforcement arm of HHS.
I'd like to ask a question of Omar. Omar, can you imagine a circumstance in which a HITRUST certified organization would not comply with HIPAA?
At the time they were certified, it would be very difficult to identify an organization that didn't comply as long as the scope of applications was consistent. So HITRUST is probably the single best way to demonstrate compliance against HIPAA.
Or PCI DSS?
Or PCI, yeah.
Or Sarbanes-Oxley?
Yeah.
GLBA?
Probably.
So, you know, the problem with all of those others, with the exception of PCI DSS,
yep,
is that if you go through the process of creating compliance with HIPAA, with Sarbanes-Oxley, with GLBA, you're still not sure that you're going to pass an audit after a breach.
Yeah, the way I think about it is I've got a 7-year-old who, she comes home after she takes a test and I ask her, how'd you do? What do you think she says?
Okay.
She says, okay. Or she said, I did great and I studied really hard. But I don't really care at the end of the day what my 7-year-old tells me. I care what her teacher tells me.
Yeah.
So I care what grade she got. I'm not really interested in, yeah, I do care about how she studied and the discipline and all that, but ultimately the outcome I'm looking for is not my daughter's opinion, I'm looking for a teacher's opinion. And that's sort of what HITRUST gives you.
So from a business efficiency standpoint, from a cost reduction standpoint, from an assurance of quality standpoint, as I look at HITRUST, it just seems to me like, well, I can comply with this and this, or this and this, and I can cross my fingers and hope I don't have a breach, and if I do have a breach, what are my penalties going to be? Or I can comply with HITRUST and have a high level of assurance that if there are any penalties, they're going to be minimal, because I have shown due diligence and a true effort to reach a very high level of compliance that probably exceeds the standards of the compliance auditor that are coming out to talk to me.
Yep, that's going to be true in many cases.
Okay, that's my case for believing in HITRUST.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. We have time maybe for one more question.
So I have a question for Tom and for Omar, and this is coming from Fortinet, we're a security solutions vendor, and in your experience with putting together this framework, how effective has it been in how security providers or vendors are baking in compliance to their security solutions? And are there any notable standouts that you see where that has been effective in the process of helping with what you're putting together and with also just compliance overall?
I'll let you answer that, and then I have an
Thanks,
answer on a
Tom.
very specific slice of that.
You know, Doug, I think that's a really good question. I don't think we've put enough attention on that. We've been so focused on the programmatic side of it that we haven't really looked at the software, the hardware, the vendors, the controls that we have implemented. So one of the things I'd like to get to next, and this is one of the points that, Doug, I think you made in your opening remark, is, you know, there's this notion of security versus compliance. One of the things that we know from the only data set that I'm aware of out there that actually can compare security and compliance, and that is Verizon was, up until at least a couple of years ago, the largest investigator of data breaches on the planet, and also the largest QSA doing certification of retailers for PCI. So they looked at both of those data sets, and in 10 years of doing both of those bodies of work, they could not find a single organization that was PCI compliant at the time of their data breach. Now, there's plenty of organizations that were PCI certified 3 or 6 or 9 months ago, but at the time of the data breach, at least one or more controls had actually lapsed at the time of the actual breach. So that data set, the conclusion would be, at least if we just pay attention to that data set and trust it, would be that if you're compliant, you're not going to have a data breach. That's what that data set shows. Now, the reality is most organizations, it's easy for them to be compliant the day the auditors show up. It's not nearly as easy for them to be compliant 3, 6, and 9 months later. And I think that report said that in 71% of cases, they at least one or more controls lapse in compliance. So to the point that you raised, Doug, what I would like to do, and where I'm trying to take my program next, is how do we check for compliance every day and every week, right? So not just once a quarter or once a year when we do the access review, the auditor shows up. If I've got 66 controls that I'm worried about, how can I review them every week and get a ticket opened automatically the moment it lapses on any single device or any piece of software or any user or any process? And that's where, you know, the technology solutions from the likes of Fortinet and the other big players really become absolutely critical.
You know, good point along that too, another plug for HITRUST here, but the framework is set up in a way, it's not just the controls itself. You know, we talked about policies and procedures implementation. There's a measured and managed aspect, which is what Omar is alluding to there, is how do you make sure these are, you know, reliable controls over time? And that's where you get your bang for the buck on that. You know, as we go through and do certification audits for a lot of organizations, it's a heavy lift just to get policy process and implemented, addressed to become certified. We tell them, you know, look at the measured and managed, but use it from a risk management perspective. Understand where your risks are and leverage those maturity levels for those key controls that you want to make sure are in place that will help ensure that you don't have a breach.
I'd also add, coming from kind of an IT infrastructure background, I think just typically IT security organizations were looking at, you know, feature functionality of things. Right. You know, what's the best firewall, how much can flow through it, and all of that is still a factor. But now, once you get a established compliance program with it, then there's more of a pivot to look at, okay, we need to look at this holistically. It's not a point solution for firewalls. Right. It's how does this all fit into not only provide the security, but also provide the compliance reporting that's necessary. So we're beginning that process, even in MultiIP, to go through and really validate to make sure all of our security components easily fit into the compliance aspect as well. So it's not a burden to kind of drag that out and then prove compliance, you know, once a year. It's a continual cycle.
Absolutely. Yeah, and especially with looking, again, visibility, right? Visibility, we have to bring it back to what are common standards. And I think this is great because instead of individual focuses, vertical specific, again, speaking of differences, let's look at similarities. What's a common thread? And in security, it's the sophistication of the attacks, right? We are up against dealing with zero-day threats that
Zero second threats.
Yeah, exactly. Is that unfortunately, if we're mired down at 400x, we can't come back and look at comprehensively unification of all verticals. So say, as a unified front, what are we doing? And that certainly plays into what you're talking about with the sake of compliance, but also looking at comprehensively, what do we have, right? We can always look at risk quotients associated with, here's where the data is stored. These are most mission critical. If they were to be compromised, how would that affect us? But we might miss other areas of that focus on, these are just devices within the organization, or they might be coming in, leaving, et cetera. And do we see the lines that are drawn to how they interact with those systems? So I think that's definitely beneficial for talking about a broader standard versus just HIPAA or PCI or otherwise.
Great point.
In terms of predictive threat analysis, there are 4 emerging threat vectors, and I call them bring your own disaster,
Yep.
the Internet of Terrible Things, and updates, patches, and images, and then finally the ever-challenging end-user anti-phishing training. So we can apply technical controls to all 4 of those. And getting back to a point that you made earlier, you can configure a high-quality SIM to look at updates and patches. You can configure it to look at new devices that are attached and the vulnerabilities that they expose. So there are technical solutions for the evolving system. And then with high quality next generation firewalls such as Fortinet, you can apply solutions even to the Internet of Terrible Things, whose current state is just really atrocious. Underwriters Laboratories is just developing a new UL standard called UL 2900 for IoT devices. And I hope that gets universal adoption. Increasingly, the industry and the end users are going to place demands on this because as you know, with the proliferation of IoT devices and the incredible exposure that they create to every single one of us in our homes and in our businesses, that's a terrible vector for sophisticated threat actors to use, and they will use it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for those insightful comments. And thanks to everybody that had the patience to listen and to ask some really great questions. So you'll have the information in your packet. You have the information to reach any of the speakers that you'd like to afterwards with questions or thoughts that occur to you. And as they stay around now, you're welcome to stay and chat. But want to thank everyone that joined us out on the web stream. And again, thank all of you that were here, all of our panelists and guests. And until next time, have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Nice job.
All right.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Paul.
you too.
Grateful. Very good.